In the barren valley where the earth cracked open beneath the sun and the wind carried dust instead of rain, a poor farmer bent down and touched the soil with his bare hands. It was the kind of ground men abandoned, a place where nothing had grown for years, where hope had dried up along with the streams that once ran through it. Neighbors called him foolish for staying, said no prayer could coax life from dead land. But the farmer didn't bow to their laughter. With calloused fingers, he pressed into the dust as though it still held secrets only the desperate could hear. Night fell heavy, the sky sharp with stars, the silence thick as a shroud. Alone in the valley, the farmer whispered into the earth, not with words of command, but with the humility of one who had lost everything yet refused to surrender. He remembered the stories of the Old West. That land was not conquered by force alone, but by the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be different. As his hands sank deeper, he felt not dirt, but a pulse, faint and hidden, like a heartbeat buried beneath centuries of drought. The hours dragged, but he did not rise. He stayed with the soil as though it were kin, as though his touch could remind it of what it once was. Coyotes howled in the distance. The wind bit at his skin, yet he remained, his silence heavier than their cries. And when exhaustion finally pulled him into sleep beneath the open sky, he dreamt of rivers winding where dust had rained, of fields swaying where only bones of cattle had once lain. At dawn, the valley was no longer barren. Where the farmer had laid his hands, shoots of green had broken through, fragile but unshaken. And as the sun climbed, the green spread, rushing across the valley floor like fire made of life instead of flame. By the time the neighbors arrived to mock him again, they stopped short, their eyes wide, their voices lost. Before them stretched fields covered in grass and bloom, as though the desert itself had chosen to remember its own forgotten promise. What began with a single touch had become a miracle the West could not ignore. The poor farmer, mocked and abandoned, had awakened a valley that men believed was dead. And as the wind rushed through the green, it carried a truth sharper than any blade. Even the driest soil can hold the memory of rain, waiting for the one who dares to believe. The neighbors stood at the edge of the valley, their mouths dry as the soil they had abandoned years ago. None dared to step closer at first, as though the green might vanish if touched. The poor farmer rose from where he had slept, his clothes still coated in dust, his eyes heavy but alive with something new, something they had never seen in him before. He didn't speak. He simply looked out over the grass that bent in the morning wind, the fragile sprouts shimmering with dew. It was as if the desert itself had bent to his faith, answering not to wealth, not to power, but to endurance. Word spread quickly, faster than the riverbeds had once flowed. Travelers who had ridden past dry bones now returned to see life stretching across the valley. Some said it was a trick, that he had hidden seeds in secret. Others whispered it was sorcery, a pact with forces no man should disturb. But the old ones, the ones who had walked the frontier long enough to know its cruelty, saw it differently. They said the land remembers, that sometimes, when a man gives his heart to the earth without expecting anything in return, the earth decides to give back. The farmer himself didn't claim the miracle. He didn't boast, didn't demand payment, didn't call himself chosen. He worked quietly, bending down to tend the shoots as though they had been waiting for his hands all along. He carried water from the well, his steps slow but steady, pouring it not on his own fields but on the farthest edges of the green, so that it would spread to where even strangers might one day sow. His humility made the miracle grow larger in the eyes of those who watched. Children were the first to run barefoot into the valley, their laughter ringing like bells against the hills. They rolled in the grass, their fingers plucking flowers they thought they'd never see outside of stories. And for a moment, even the most skeptical among the townsfolk felt their hearts soften. The barren land that had once swallowed cattle, harvests, and hope now pulsed with life. It was a reminder that the West, for all its cruelty, still carried seeds of grace hidden in its bones. But with life came envy. By the second week, strangers began arriving, men with sharp suits and sharper tongues, claiming they could make the valley bloom even brighter if only the farmer signed away his rights. They promised gold, irrigation, prosperity beyond his imagination. But the poor farmer, his hands still calloused and rough, only shook his head. "The land is not mine to sell," he said softly. "It belongs to the rain, to the roots, to the ones who need it." His words were simple, but they struck harder than any bullet, and those who heard them knew this miracle was about to be tested. The valley continued to thrive, but so did the greed circling it. Merchants came with wagons of supplies, hoping to trade at inflated prices. Ranchers brought herds, eager to graze on the farmer's grass without asking. And behind them came whispers of men who carried rifles and contracts, who believed that what blooms in the desert must be claimed by force. The poor farmer, still bent to the soil each morning, remained unmoved. He had not asked for the miracle, and he would not let others turn it into a weapon. Clara, an old widow from the edge of town, came one evening with a basket of bread. She placed it in his hands and said, "They fear what they cannot own. Guard yourself." The farmer only smiled faintly and replied, "I cannot guard what is not mine. I can only tend it." But she saw the weariness in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of both wonder and danger. It was not easy to be chosen, not by wealth, not by power, but by the earth itself. That night, he dreamed again. He saw the valley not as it was, but as it could be. Fields of wheat swaying under the sun, children gathering water from streams that ran clear again, tribes and settlers eating side by side under the shade of new trees. But just as quickly, he saw fire devour it all, heard the echo of rifles splitting the dawn, felt the soil crack again into dust. He woke with his hands trembling, unsure whether the earth had given him a promise or a warning. By the third week, men with guns came riding into the valley. They carried no torches, only papers and threats, insisting that the miracle be handed over to those with the means to protect it. The farmer stood alone at first, but Clara appeared at his side, and behind her came others, the same neighbors who had mocked him before. They carried no weapons, only their presence. It was a silent line drawn across the valley, a statement that the miracle did not belong to greed. It belonged to all who needed hope. The armed men laughed, dismissing the farmer's quiet defiance. Yet the earth itself seemed to stir. Clouds gathered on the horizon, low and dark, carrying the scent of rain. For the first time in years, thunder rolled across the valley, and fat drops of water struck the soil. The men froze, their papers damp, their rifles slick. The farmer looked up, his face lit by lightning, and whispered, "The land has chosen." And in that moment, even his enemies felt the truth. This valley was not theirs to claim. It had already decided its keeper. The storm that broke over the valley that night was unlike any in living memory. Sheets of rain hammered the ground, each drop exploding against the soil like the long-awaited return of a promise. The poor farmer stood barefoot in the downpour, his arms open, his face lifted, as though he were welcoming an old friend home. Around him, the green surged, swelling into rivers that cut across the dry cracks, filling them until the land drank deeply. And for the first time in years, the valley sang, not with voices, but with water. The men who had come to claim the miracle fled in chaos, their rifles forgotten in the mud, their contracts reduced to pulp in the rain. What had once given them power now meant nothing in the face of the storm. Clara, watching from the cabin window, whispered to herself, "The desert chose its keeper." And in the town beyond, people woke to the thunder, knowing instinctively that something had shifted. This was no ordinary rain. It was justice, long delayed, now delivered. At dawn, the valley shimmered as though a painter had poured emerald over the earth. Streams twisted through the fields, wildflowers burst open, and the cattle that wandered in from the hills drank until their bellies swelled. Children ran again into the grass, their laughter carried on air cleansed of dust. The farmer, though drenched and weary, began working immediately. He built channels to guide the water, shaped dikes with his hands, refusing to let a drop be wasted. To him, the miracle was not for glory, it was responsibility. By midday, strangers returned, not with rifles or papers this time, but with tools and buckets. Ashamed of their earlier greed, they asked if they could help. The farmer said nothing at first, only looked at Clara. She nodded gently, and he finally replied, "If you plant, it will grow, but you must tend it as I have, with patience." with humility. His voice was soft, but his words carried the weight of a vow, and the people listened. From that day, the valley was no longer his alone. Families came to sow seeds, to gather water, to build homes along the edges of the green. But though the land grew generous, they all knew it had not chosen them. It had chosen the poor farmer who once touched the dry soil with nothing but faith. And so, even as they worked, they watched him with reverence, knowing the valley's life pulsed first through his hands. As the seasons passed, the valley transformed into a place spoken of in distant towns. Once a wasteland, it became known as the Emerald Hollow, where grass swayed in the wind like waves upon an inland sea. Travelers came to see it, skeptics left in silence, and those who stayed found themselves changed, not just by the abundance, but by the spirit that held the valley together. The farmer never claimed leadership, never sought authority, yet every decision turned to him as if the land itself whispered through his silence. Clara remained by his side, her presence the anchor that steadied him when the weight of the miracle grew heavy. She became the voice he rarely used, reminding others that this was not magic, not luck, but the fruit of faith and endurance. "Do not worship the green," she told them often. "Remember the dust. Remember who believed when the rest of us turned away." Her words wove humility into the valley's fabric, ensuring it did not fall prey to pride. But envy never dies easily in the West. Beyond the mountains, powerful ranchers heard of the transformation and saw only opportunity. They whispered of driving the farmer out, of taking what he had awakened. For them, the valley was not sacred. It was profit waiting to be claimed. Their riders scouted at night, their eyes measuring the fields, their plans tightening like a noose. The people of the valley felt the tension rise, though no enemy had yet crossed the line. The farmer, sensing the shadow creeping closer, did not prepare weapons. Instead, he walked the valley each night, his hands brushing the stalks of wheat, his bare feet pressing the soil. To him, the land was alive, listening. He did not ask it to fight for him. He simply promised he would never abandon it. And in the stillness, with the stars burning overhead, it seemed the earth itself pulsed in answer, as though it too had chosen to endure. When the first riders finally appeared at the edge of the green, armed and sneering, they expected fear. Instead, they saw the farmer standing quietly in the center of the field, the wind bending the grass around him, his silence unshaken. Behind him, dozens of families rose from their cabins, not with guns, but with shovels, hoes, and the strength of those who had seen life rise from dust. And in that moment, the riders realized they weren't facing a poor farmer. They were facing a valley that had remembered its own power and would not be betrayed again. The riders paused, their horses stamping uneasily, as if the animals themselves felt the resistance rising from the soil. The poor farmer stood with his head slightly bowed, not in submission, but in quiet defiance. He had no rifle slung across his shoulder, no revolver at his hip, only the presence of a man who had already walked through the wilderness of abandonment and returned with life in his hands. Behind him, the people of the valley formed a line that stretched across the green like a living wall. Men, women, and children stood together, not with anger, but with resolve. The leader of the riders spat into the grass, mocking their silence. He barked about contracts, about rights of ownership, about the law of the West being written by those who held the most land and the most guns. But as his words spilled out, something happened that silenced even him. From the edge of the valley came a slow roll of thunder, though the sky above was clear. The sound trembled through the soil, vibrating beneath the hooves of the horses, echoing like the voice of the earth itself. Clara stepped forward then, her hands steady, her voice calm, yet unyielding. She spoke not with threats, but with truth. "This valley does not belong to you," she said. "It does not belong to any man who would claim it for greed. It belongs to those who believed in it when it was dead, and it belongs to the soil that gave back what we thought was lost." Her words were not shouted, yet they carried through the fields like wind, settling in every ear until even the riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. The farmer remained silent, but his silence carried more weight than speeches ever could. He bent once more, touched the grass with his calloused hand, and lifted his eyes to meet those of the riders. There was no fear, no plea, only certainty. And in that gaze, they saw something that unsettled them deeply. The man was not guarding land. He was part of it. To fight him would be to fight the valley itself. And that was a battle no man could win. The standoff stretched into a silence that pressed down heavier than gunpowder smoke. The riders, for all their bluster, felt it, the futility of trying to seize what had already chosen its keeper. One by one, their eyes lowered, their horses turned, and the sound of hooves faded back into the desert. The people did not cheer, did not chase. They simply stood with the farmer in the field, knowing the valley had once again declared its will. In the weeks that followed, the valley bloomed brighter than before, as if rewarding the people's faith. Crops grew tall, streams ran clear, and herds grazed on grass that seemed endless. Travelers who passed through called it a miracle, but those who lived there knew better. It wasn't a miracle born of magic. It was the fruit of endurance, humility, and the willingness to protect what the earth had given. The farmer worked as tirelessly as ever, never claiming glory, never setting himself above the others. To him, tending the land was its own reward. Clara, however, understood that stories mattered as much as soil. She told the tale of how the valley had once been dust, how a single man's touch had awakened it, and how the people had stood together to defend it. She told it to children gathered by the fire, to strangers resting in the shade, to widows who thought their hope was gone. Her words spread far beyond the valley, and soon the Emerald Hollow was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of what could happen when faith refused to die. The poor farmer never interrupted her stories. He would sit quietly, listening, his eyes focused on the fire or the fields outside. Yet, every now and then, when Clara spoke of the night he first touched the soil, he would press his palm against his knee, as though remembering the weight of that moment. He knew the truth better than anyone. The valley had not come alive because of him. It had come alive because he had been willing to believe when no one else would. Seasons shifted once more, and with them came challenges, droughts that tested their wells, storms that tore down their fences, whispers of envy that drifted again from beyond the mountains. Yet through it all, the valley endured, not because it was invincible, but because the people had learned what the farmer had always known. The desert only yields to those who do not abandon it. Their strength was not in weapons or wealth, but in patience, in labor, and in faith. And as the years passed, the Emerald Hollow stood as a beacon in the Old West, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, where betrayal and greed often ruled, there were still places where life could flourish. And at the heart of it all remained the poor farmer, silent and steadfast, whose touch had awakened more than a valley. It had awakened a people. As time wove its threads across the valley, the story of the poor farmer became part of the land itself. Travelers from distant towns spoke of him as though he were carved in a legend. Yet those who lived near him knew he remained the same. A man of few words, hands hardened by work, eyes softened by the steady sight of green where once there had been only dust. He did not seek recognition, nor did he resist it. He let the people tell their stories, while he continued to tend the soil at dawn and rest beneath the stars at night. Children grew up hearing Clara's voice painting the tale of the valley's rebirth. They would run barefoot through the fields, daring one another to find the exact place where the farmer's hands had first touched the dry ground. Though no one knew the spot for certain, the children swore they could feel warmth in the soil there, as if the earth itself remembered. To them, it was not just history. It was proof that even in the harshest deserts, life could bloom if someone believed hard enough. But prosperity never comes without shadows. Beyond the valley, whispers of jealousy began to stir again. Powerful ranchers, who measured worth only in acres and herds, spoke bitterly of the farmer who had turned dust into gold without a gun or a claim. They feared what his valley represented, that the land did not belong solely to those who could buy it or conquer it, but to those who nurtured it. Such an idea was dangerous in a West built on dominance. And so, once more, they began a plot. Clara sensed the danger before it arrived. She noticed the way scouts lingered on the ridges longer than travelers should, the way letters came from distant towns, offering gold in exchange for just a share of the valley. She warned the farmer, her voice steady but her heart unsettled. They will not stop, not as long as they think they can own what cannot be owned. He listened, his silence carrying the weight of acknowledgement, though his face showed no fear. He had stood against fire, against rifles, against abandonment itself. He would stand again. The people of the valley also began to prepare, not with weapons, but with unity. They strengthened their homes, dug deeper wells, and planted more than they needed, so none could be starved into submission. They knew that what bound them together was greater than greed, and they would not let it be broken. The valley had chosen them, and they would protect it, not with conquest, but with endurance. The first sign of trouble came with smoke. One morning, black columns rose on the horizon, carrying the smell of burning fields. The ranchers who envied the valley had set fire to the outer plains, hoping the flames would crawl toward the Emerald Hollow. Panic rippled through the people, but the farmer did not waver. He walked to the edge of the fields, pressed his hand once more into the soil, and began digging trenches with nothing but his shovel. One by one, others joined him until a line of fire breaks stretched across the valley floor. The flames reached the line and faltered. The earth, wet from the streams the farmer had carefully guided, refused to carry the fire. Instead, the blaze curled back on itself, consuming the plains of the very men who had lit it. From the ridges, riders watched in stunned silence as their plan collapsed, and the valley stood untouched. Some claimed they saw the farmer raise his head to the wind, as though the land itself had answered him once again. Others swore they heard Clara singing, her voice carrying above the crackle of flames, steady and defiant. When the fire died, the valley was greener than ever, nourished by the ash that had tried to destroy it. The people gathered to celebrate, but the farmer did not smile. He knew greed did not burn out as easily as brushwood. It would return again and again, wearing new faces, carrying new weapons. And yet, he also knew something more powerful. The valley had endured once, and it would endure again. For every attempt to destroy it had only made it stronger. In the days that followed, families from neighboring towns began moving to the Emerald Hollow, seeking refuge from drought and the cruelty of landowners who valued cattle more than lives. The farmer welcomed them silently, helping them build cabins, guiding their hands as they planted. Clara spoke for him, reminding each newcomer of the vow they must uphold. This valley belongs to no one alone. It is not wealth. It is not property. It is hope, and it must be shared. Her words sank deep, and the people listened. Thus, the valley grew, not just in green fields, but in community. What had begun with one poor farmer touching dry soil had become a haven, a sanctuary against greed and despair. And though threats still circled beyond its borders, the Emerald Hollow stood resilient, a living testament that even in the most unforgiving West, endurance could turn dust into life, silence into power, and despair into hope. The years that followed tested the Emerald Hollow in ways no rifle ever could. Drought swept across the West again, crueler than before, turning rivers into cracked scars and ranchlands into graves of cattle. Entire towns packed their wagons and fled, chasing rumors of water farther north. But in the hollow, the streams still trickled, the crops still stood, and the people still endured. Travelers came in disbelief, their eyes wide at the green that thrived where everywhere else had withered. To them, it seemed as if the valley itself had chosen to defy the sky. The poor farmer never claimed it as his doing. When strangers asked how the hollow survived, he only said, "The land remembers." He meant it simply, but the words spread, echoing in saloons and markets until they became more than explanation. They became prophecy. People began to speak of the farmer as a guardian, a man tied to the earth by something deeper than roots. Some came to seek his blessing. Others came to challenge it. Yet no matter their intent, all left changed, unsettled by his quiet presence. Clara aged alongside him, her hair silver, her voice slower, but her spirit sharper than ever. She told the children who gathered at her knee not just the story of the valley's rebirth, but the lesson it carried, that endurance, not conquest, was the true strength of the West. "Anyone can take," she would say softly, "but only the brave contend." Her words wove into the fabric of the hollow, shaping its people into more than survivors. They became keepers of something sacred. Beyond the borders, resentment smoldered. Ranchers who had once mocked the farmer now saw their own lands crumble while his flourished. They whispered of curses, of witchcraft, of unnatural forces. Some plotted revenge, but their plans never reached the valley. Horses went lame on the approach, storms rolled in sudden and fierce, scouts vanished into the night without trace. It was as if the desert itself stood as a sentinel, protecting the green it had once allowed to die. Fear, more than bullets, kept enemies away. Through it all, the farmer remained unchanged. Each dawn, he rose with the sun, touched the soil with his calloused hands, and worked in silence. To him, there was no miracle, no curse, no prophecy. There was only the land and the duty to care for it. And in his quiet persistence, the people of the Emerald Hollow found their greatest lesson, that sometimes the most extraordinary thing a man can do is refuse to abandon what others have already buried. When the poor farmer grew old, the valley was no longer just a patch of green in the desert. It was a sanctuary, a living legend whispered in towns across the frontier. Families who had once fled poverty now thrived, their children running barefoot in fields of wheat, their wells brimming with water that refused to run dry. The hollow had become more than a place. It was a symbol, and at the center of it all, still humble, still silent, was the man who had first touched the soil when no one else believed. Clara, frail but steadfast, sat by his side in those final years, reminding him of the beginning when the valley had been nothing but dust and laughter from those who mocked him. "Do you see what you've done?" she would ask, her voice trembling with pride. He would only shake his head, eyes fixed on the horizon. "The land did it," he would answer. Yet, even in his modesty, she knew the truth, that without his endurance, the earth's memory would have remained buried forever. As his final days approached, the people of the hollow gathered to honor him, not with banners or speeches, but with silence. They stood in the fields he had awakened, their heads bowed, their hands pressed to the soil, mirroring the act that had begun it all. And when the farmer passed quietly one morning, seated on his porch with the dawn rising before him, they buried him beneath the oldest tree in the valley. No stone marked the spot, only the roots that stretched deeper with each season. Clara outlived him by a few years, enough to see the first grandchildren of the hollow born, enough to know that the legacy of endurance would not die with them. When she joined him beneath the tree, the people carved no words, no names, only a single symbol, two hands pressed into the earth. It was enough. Everyone who looked upon it understood. And so the Emerald Hollow endured, long after the farmer and Clara were gone. Travelers who entered the valley felt a hush fall over them, as though the land itself was alive with memory. Some swore they heard the rustle of wheat like a voice. Others claimed to feel a pulse in the ground. Whether miracle or not, one truth remained. The valley had been born of faith, and it lived on because of endurance. And in the West, where dust often swallowed dreams, that made it the rarest treasure of all. The story of the Emerald Hollow is not just about a valley reborn. It is about the unshakable strength of endurance. A poor farmer, mocked and abandoned, pressed his hands into dry soil and chose to believe when the world around him had already given up. What followed was not merely the return of rain or the blossoming of green. It was proof that even in the harshest deserts, hope can take root when faith refuses to die. His silence spoke louder than any promise, and his persistence carved life where none should have been. Clara's voice reminded the people that miracles are not meant to be owned, but shared. Together, they built a community where envy could not conquer and greed could not reign. The valley endured because it was tended with humility, not conquest. And in that endurance, it became more than a place. It became a truth. That truth continues to whisper even now. Life does not come to those who abandon the land, but to those who remain when everything else is withered. The poor farmer never called himself chosen. He never claimed power. Yet the land chose him because he embodied what the West too often forgot. That survival is not about strength alone, but about the quiet courage to remain when others flee. His story, passed through Clara's words, became a compass for all who face their own deserts. It tells us that what seems barren may still carry a hidden heartbeat, waiting for someone brave enough to believe in it again. And so, the legacy of the Emerald Hollow is not locked in the past. It lives in every choice we make, to endure or to abandon, to tend or to take, to build or to destroy. Perhaps the green fields will fade one day, perhaps storms will come again, but the lesson remains eternal. Even the driest soil remembers rain, and even the harshest life can bloom if met with faith and endurance. That is the true treasure of the West, one more valuable than gold or land. If this story touched your heart, let it live on. Subscribe to this channel so that more voices of the Old West can reach you. Like the video if you believe in the power of endurance, and share in the comments what this tale means to you. Your voice keeps these stories alive, and together we ensure that they, like the Emerald Hollow, will endure for generations to come.